Hello YouTube. Uh, it's my second video today, because I don't have a whole lot to do. This is a response to Girl Writes What. She'll probably never see this video because she apparently has like 2 bazillion subscribers. But I just watched a video about her, or of hers, where she went on this whole thing about, basically it was like the evolutionary psychology of gender and how that relates to feminism today, right? Now, I think I agree with her overarching thesis, which is, I think, twofold. First of all, that objectification of both men and women is an integral and essential feature of the discourse of seduction, let's say. I think I'd agree with that. I'd have to think about it further. The second one is that mainstream, let's say mainstream feminists, the ones who are getting a bad rap on YouTube, the ones who are around Atheism Plus and like Rebecca Watson and all them, I do think that there is a tendency to conceive of the issues surrounding feminism in an asymmetrical way, right? Or let's say hypocritical way, particularly around issues like objectification. So I concede those 2 points right off the bat. But what I'm more dodgy about is the analysis that she gives of well, in cave times, your body type reflects fertility, and so the male is attracted to the female, and all these kinds of evolutionary psychology explanations. It seems to me this is where I think we part ways. Now, I don't want to deny, obviously, that there is a biological dimension to attraction. That's obvious, right? It's trivial. But there is also a discursive dimension, and that seems to be what's not fleshed out. So on the one hand, there are these two things operating next to each other. On the one hand, the discursive, and on the other hand, the biological. Now, precisely what that interrelation is an interesting question, and a very difficult question, especially given the fact that what we think of as cave times that you reference, our history goes back much further than that, right? So we've been kicking around, say, low estimate, 100,000 years. And so around 95 years later, history begins, right? We'd only sort of reconstruct back before this. But let's say that I don't even think that you would need, for instance, a biological mechanism to shape the sociosexual relationships around attraction, right? So a lot of the examples that you give, for instance, are conclusions that simply can arise discursively, right? So I see a woman with a certain kind of figure, and I will say that the urge to propagate is absolutely biological. There's no question about it, right? But I have this urge to propagate, and I have certain material circumstances. People around me, for instance, might 1 out of 6 kids might make it, right? It's those kinds of situations. So you're put into a social reality where you have to put out a lot of babies. On top of that, there's a certain discourse that emerges where, since we're living in a tribal realm, right? Like there's social status at work, and there's all these mechanisms at work, and none of those have to be biological per se. Or I would say that the relationship between the biological and the social is something that's too, let's say, too unspecified to really, make claims and give accounts that well, right? But again, all I'm saying is that I can imagine the sociosexual norms that you're talking about emerging without need for the biology. Now, take it one step further, though. Now, the reason I mentioned that we've been around on this planet for so long is that if you have 95,000 years of discourse of men trying to get with women and women trying to get with men, and whatever, if you have 95,000 years of that, right? Our language is constituted in large part by that kind of activity, right? So our ability, or how we conceive of sexuality, is necessarily different than how, let's say, a dog conceives of sexuality. And the reason why is that human beings have this profound ability to abstract, put things into language, quantify, represent things in signs and symbols, and do all of these things. We have this ability that is, other animals have it, but it's brought out for us to a ridiculous extreme. And that ability is necessarily tied to the activity of conceiving of a sexual ideal, because that ideal is an abstract, is abstract. It is an abstraction, right? So our linguistic abilities are tied into this, right? So our linguistic abilities are tied into our sexuality is tied into our linguistics. So over 95,000 years of this happening, and mind you, it being the center of our lives, the center of our being, in a way that it's not now. I can put off getting married and having kids nowadays because it's not, the focal point of my existence. It's just something maybe I'll do later, right? Like, imagine that mindset back then. It doesn't make sense. So you have a certain amount of history, and you have certain material conditions that when those material conditions are put, when people are put into those material conditions, certain norms emerge. And I don't see any need for anything biological beyond the urge to have sex, and beyond the ability for language. Precisely what the biology of that is of course an issue of contention, right? Once you have those two biological realities, you can put people into material conditions, and a certain set of norms will emerge. Now, those norms kind of more or less didn't change very much for 95,000 years. So the fact is, over time, the innate structures of our discourse, let's say the indexicality of our language, the sort of the subtleties and the nuance of our language, have all, I don't want to say they've necessarily reified into place, but it would be amazing to me if they didn't carry with them markers of that sexualization, right? It would just be, it would seem to me to be a remarkable statement. And so as such, because of that linguistic idea, and also the social idea, and also the ideal gender role, and all of this over 95,000 years can get frozen into place, right? So it seems to me that given that amount of time, and given the fact that those were formative years in the development of language, in the development of culture, and all of this, those effects can be wildly systemic without necessarily being biological, right? There's no reason to be like a biological determinist when it comes to gender, insofar as we're talking about these issues, right? So when you talk about cave times and instincts, I'm kind of with you, but the problem is that I don't see how any of that makes it a necessity. Right? I don't see how the relationships between men and women become a biological necessity from anything that you have advanced. It doesn't mean that they don't exist, right? It doesn't mean that you certainly gave an apt description, um, possibly an apt description. I'll put it that way. I'd have to, hit the books to really criticize you. So that in and of itself is an accomplishment, right? But even if you gave an apt description of the causality at work, it doesn't necessarily imply any kind of biological determinism qua gender, right? And that's a much harder case to support, right? So when you say that women have the power to attract men, in these social relations and all of this, it seems to me that you then take the attitude of, well, and that's just the way it is because we're constituted that way. It seems extremely hasty, let's say, to therefore come to the conclusion that we will always be constituted that way and that we can't change our sociosexual relations, right? So again, this isn't necessarily a critique of your theses. This is just a critique of what seems to me to be altogether a much too hasty and unjustified identification with the discursive, with the discursive and the biological, right? And yeah, I think that's my critique of your position. You can call me a feminist, you can call me not a feminist, don't really care. I hope you have a good day though, and I really liked your video.